Welcome to Stoa. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're going to be talking about Stoicism and sport. Do you want to kick us off, Michael?
Yeah, really happy to talk about this topic. So, for those that don't know me personally, which is many of you, I come from a sport background. So, I grew up as a martial artist. My dad runs a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mixed martial arts studio. So, I actually grew up in the world of sport and particularly in the world of martial arts before I ever studied philosophy or ever came to philosophy. And so, it's always been a topic that's really interested me. And then it's kind of colored my reading and my study of the Stoics. Because once you start looking for something, you start seeing it. And the Stoic actually, perhaps surprisingly, talk quite a bit about, and there's a lot of similarities the Stoics draw between sport and philosophy, and I want to try to pull out some of those here. So there's three main things I wanted to talk about, Caleb. And the first, I'm going to cover the similarities between sport and Stoicism. So what these two things have in common, which might sound surprising, but I think there's quite a bit. The second thing I'm going to talk about is Stoicism for Sport. So if you are an athlete, or more generally, anybody who puts themselves in kind of high performance contexts, how can Stoicism help in those cases? How can Stoicism benefit you? And the third thing I'm going to talk about is sport for Stoicism. If you're practicing Stoics, sport provides an opportunity to practice that Stoicism and become a better Stoic. So it's not just that you use Stoicism to help your athletic performance, but you can actually use your athletic performance to help your Stoicism. So that's what I'm going to cover. And again, in terms of my background, I'm a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I competed in mixed martial arts, including professionally. I also was a varsity wrestler in university. So I'm coming from a position of a lot of experience competing in an individual sport in kind of a high pressure context in that sense, and doing those things while I had also was studying Stoicism. So kind of combining them both at the same time and coming up with kind of this approach. So to start us off, I want to talk about the similarities between Stoicism and sport. And is just a kind of different way to approach this question. And the first thing that I want to kind of highlight is that both are a craft. So I would say the thing that any athlete and any philosopher has in common is I would say they're both practicing a craft. The ancient Greek word for this was techne, and that's where we get the word for technique from. And this meant kind of a specialized skill set or a specialized knowledge about how to do something. So you might say that a shoemaker has their techne of shoemaking. And Stoics saw philosophy as kind of the techne of living, right? So the good shoemaker made shoes well. The philosopher lives well. They have an excellent techne of living. And your sport, whatever your sport is, that's the techne of that sport. So if I'm doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the techne is, how to effectively beat people at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, how to control them positionally, how to submit them. If it's soccer, it's how to help your team win at that. But either way, any of these things are crafts. And I think when you want to develop the techne of living well, if you look at that as kind of an abstract thing, it can seem very difficult, very hard to accomplish. But when you make an analogy to any or other sort of techne, then it can seem a lot more simple, right? So you say, well, I want to become a Stoic. I want to learn how to live well. Well, what you do is you think, well, what's another craft? What's another skill set that I've developed? And, if I've learned how to be a good soccer player, if I've learned how to be a good martial artist, there were certain things that I did to do that, right? I set a goal for myself. I practiced intentionally. I received and was receptive to feedback. I incorporated that feedback into my training. There's these certain ways that we know provide good skill development. And I guess that's kind of my first point, is that Stoicism and sport have a lot in common because they both kind of exist in that domain of applied skills. So already they're on kind of the same playing field, just the skill that they're aiming at is a very different one, living versus being an adept basketball player. Did you have any thoughts on that?
I think the connection between skill is exactly right. And to build on that a little bit, I think that there's a focus in a lot of modern life philosophies, which is around being good or being holy if you're religious or something like this, that is distinct from the ancient Stoic sense of good, which is closer to skill, building up techniques, or in particular displaying excellence in your craft. Excellence as a human generally would be what is good. And this shift is a similarity one has with Stoicism and sport.
Yeah, and we often talk about philosophy or ancient Greek philosophy and Stoicism as being kind of a lived philosophy. And I would say that's the distinction, right? Like modern ethics, a lot of those things are not lived philosophies because they're more descriptive. They're like the basketball analyst, right? Where Stoicism is about being the good basketball player. So the Stoic is judged by their capacity to act well, to be virtuous. The basketball player is judged by their capacity to, win games, get the ball in the net, dribble skillfully. Whereas the analyst is judged by their capacity to describe effectively what's going on. And I think a lot of modern ethics is in that analyst position. They're very good at describing, and they don't really care if they're a good person or not. That's not really what they think they're doing. That's not really, I'm a terrible person, but I'm a great ethicist. And that's almost,
Right.
that is a coherent thing to say in modern ethics. And that's a non-craft like view of philosophy.
Yeah, I think to make this, another way to put this is that the ancient philosophers made competence a virtue, in a way, competence across a number of different domains. Whereas today we might think of competence more as like engineering or something that's not so much related to value or morality. But that's just not so on the ancient picture.
Yeah, which I think is good. I prefer the craft view. The second benefit that I wanted to hit on that I think is a real similarity, if you come from a sport background or if you trained in athletics before, which is that both recognize or reframe hardship as something that is beneficial, as something that is necessary and desired. At the very least, there's opportunities to take value from hardships. There's opportunities to take value from obstacles. This is one thing Epictetus does where he makes an explicit comparison between sport and philosophy. Because, when something difficult happens to you, imagine that God is like your wrestling coach. Imagine God is like your trainer, and he's giving you a task to overcome such that you can become a better wrestler. He's giving you a difficult training partner such that you can become a more skilled athlete. And so what the athlete does, when they go to practice, they say, I want a hard practice. I want to struggle because I understand that makes me better at my craft. I understand that I get better from this feedback, from failing, from difficulty. And the Stoic, because they're practicing the craft, also adopts that perspective. Another thing I love that Epictetus says about athletes and compares them to Stoics, he says we can actually learn from athletes. Because, if you went into the wrestling room and you gave a wrestler a weak training partner, you gave them a poor training partner, they would be disappointed. They would say, look, I want somebody that can beat me because I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to develop. And he says, you should almost take on that wrestler mentality when you face hardships. It's like, give me something at the very edge of what I can handle such that I can become better. Any thoughts on that?
The use of sports metaphors in that context you see that a lot in Stoicism, and it's very useful to return to. So Epictetus talks about it quite a lot. Marcus Aurelius also has the example where you should think of often people or obstacles you face as a sort of thing that wrestling adversary would throw at you, which is, of course, the same line that Epictetus takes. And the thought there is that this is something that's part of the game, right? It's a way to improve. It's expected, not surprising.
Yeah, totally. And another Marcus Aurelius line I love about sport, paraphrasing a bit here, is he says, I'm not like a fencer, but I'm a boxer, right? Because my tool is always part of me. And it's this sense of, when we think of this craft, right? This craft analogy, which I'm really going to hammer in here, the craft of a Stoic is to be a good person. So you're kind of always doing that craft. Like the same way the boxer always has their fist, they always have their tool. Whereas these other athletes, they're only a basketball player when they're playing basketball. But the Stoic is always a Stoic. You're always kind of fine-tuning that craft. That's another great Marcus Aurelius line on this. The third thing I wanted to talk about in this category was between similarities between sport and Stoicism, is I think that both make a division between training and competition. And what I mean by that is both kind of have this conception that you intentionally practice in one context such that you can perform in another. So the idea is that if you didn't practice, which is to say, if you never did things intentionally, whether as an athlete or a Stoic, if you never as a Stoic, you never intentionally kind of attempted to cultivate your character, did difficult things, tried to be courageous, interrogated your belief system, attempted to be more, empathetic and rational. If you never did that, then when kind of the big moments come, you're going to be unprepared. And it's the same thing with the athlete. So there's always this kind of view of, so if you never practiced, you'd be not prepared for competition. But likewise, you don't want to always practice. And this is something that Epictetus criticizes with his students, where, they can brag about how much they can recite Chrysippus, or they're able to master these logic puzzles, but, they're not going out and demonstrating great character. They're not going out and doing great things, or they're reluctant to. And this is kind of the person who is too much in a sense. They don't recognize that the training is for a purpose. The training is to do something else. So that view, this kind of movement between two stages, skill development and then performance, skill development, reflection, refinement, and then performance. The movement between those two is something that both sport and Stoicism, I think, share as crafts.
Yeah, in Stoicism, there's the emphasis on the practice of premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, which Seneca reminded his friend Lucilius to imagine exile, death of loved ones, or what have you, as a way to practice facing different obstacles. And you can do that on the sort of intense scale that Seneca suggests, or a much smaller scale as well, as a way to both, I think, as it does in sport, improve your psychological resilience. So when these things occur, you can be better prepared in the moment in the psychological sense, but also think about how would you face that if it was actually thrown at you. And that way you can improve your planning as well. So I think both sport in the sort of isolated sense, it's useful to imagine what could go wrong in the sports case, in the business case, but also in this broader life sense. And it's a practice that people have found useful, the Stoics in particular, for quite some time. So it's always good to see practices like that stand the test of time.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think that's the premeditation of evils is a great example of that. And the idea is that you have to practice, right? If you're not doing the work and something terrible happens, well, it's no wonder it catches you off guard. It's no wonder it's too much to handle because you didn't do your practice. But likewise, the practice is for a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And if you kind of shut yourself away and you just premeditate evils, but you don't go out and live, you don't expose yourself to chance, you don't expose yourself to, caring about people because you're afraid of them dying, you don't expose yourself to trying, professional or personal ventures because you're afraid of them failing. Well, then what was all that practice for? It wasn't for anything, right? You have to also go out and compete. And that's another thing that Epictetus reminds us, is that whenever something bad happens, he says, think to yourself, well, this is the Olympic Games. This is what I've been training for. This is what I've been waiting for. And now is the time to show it off. Now is the time to perform. And that kind of mindset shift about difficulties, I think, is personally really helpful. I think it's even ironically helpful for athletes. And maybe I'll get into that. I'll talk about Stoicism for Sport. But I think even just like reminding yourself as an athlete, like, this is what I've been training for. This is why I've been doing all that work. This is my time to shine. Not just great in life, it's great in sport too. So I'll jump into the second category now, unless you had any other thoughts on that.
No, second category. Let's do it.
Yeah, I could talk forever about it. This is my jam, so I'll just you have to cut me off.
I've got to jump in actively
because I love this stuff. So the second part I wanted to talk about was Stoicism for Sport. And if you're listening to this episode, it's probably because you have an interest in sport. But I think this applies generally, as I was saying, to any sort of high performance idea. I've taught a couple lessons. I did over a couple of years. I did a series of workshops with my university's varsity soccer team. So I was helping them with kind of adopt a Stoic mindset. And I also teach martial arts. So I teach these Stoic values when I'm teaching jiu-jitsu. And it's really helpful for athletes. I think the first thing that I try to teach when I'm looking at the benefit of Stoicism for sport is to take responsibility for your emotions, or to take responsibility for your reaction to external events. So one of the key ideas of Stoicism is that, things happen, situations occur, but our reactions to those situations are up to us. Our reactions to those situations are things that we participate in, things that we do. One of the ways, and we talk about this a lot on our channel, but one of the ways this manifests is in the cognitive view of emotions, which is the idea that emotions are value judgments. Emotions are the results of us ascribing value to things going on. So an example of an athlete not taking responsibility for their emotions is an athlete they get all pissed off and they say, well, the ref screwed me over. The ref made the wrong call. And they're taking this view of, this thing happened, so I'm angry. I'm angry because the ref made a bad call. There's nothing I can do because a ref making a bad call deserves an angry response, or not even deserves, necessitates an angry response. You got screwed over, a bad thing happened. And so one of the first insights of Stoicism to athletes in particular, especially if they're not practicing Stoics, is that there's this gap, as Viktor Frankl talks about, there's this gap between stimulus and response. There's this gap between what happens in the event, in the sport, and how you react to it, and take responsibility for what happens in that gap. It is not the opponent scores, so now you're sad. It is not the ref makes a bad call, so now you're angry. It is those things happen. There's a gap. There's time to reflect. There's time for you to take responsibility. And then there's the output. So I think that's step one. That's the first thing that I talk about when I'm talking about a Stoic approach to sport. And I think that's really helpful for athletes to understand that just like their physical skill, there's a mental craft or a kind of mental skill to being resilient, and not resilient in the sense of how much can you put up with, how much difficulty can you endure, but resilient also in terms of your focus or your ability to remain calm and focus on your technique as situations are fluctuating. Did I explain that okay? What did you think about that?
No, I think that sounds great. That sounds great. And I agree with it 100%.
Totally persuaded. And so then the next question we have is, okay, well, another thing that I point out with athletes when I talk about athletes is about actually the harm of passion. Because sometimes athletes have this perspective that, I'm going to get really pumped up. I'm going to get really psyched up. But one thing we know from sports psychology is there's actually this ideal state of arousal. And what this means is that if you do not care about your big competition, you will perform worse. If you care too much, you will also perform worse. So the goal is this middle idea. So the idea is, as you care, your performance increases, but after a certain amount of caring, your performance starts to decrease. A certain amount of emotion, a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of intensity and tension towards the event. Mm-hmm. So athletic performance is about staying in that middle ground as well. And I know, especially when I was working with soccer players, there was kind of this, almost this pushback to Stoicism, because there was almost this value of, I want to have this big reaction when we win. It shows that I care. If we get upset when we lose, it shows that I care. And, the fact that I'm getting mad at the referee just shows how invested I am. The fact that I get a red card defending my teammate just shows how much I care about my teammate and all of these things. One of the insights of Stoicism is about the kind of effect that passions or extreme emotions can have on performance. So in a Stoic case, it's kind of like an ethical performance. Like if I'm angry, I tend to do worse things. I tend to be more of a jerk. Mm-hmm. But in sport, it's like athletic performance. If I'm angry, I'm not thinking about my role in the game. I'm not thinking about my performance. I'm thinking about something else. Likewise, if I'm upset, likewise, if I'm celebrating early and I think, wow, there's 5 minutes left and I'm winning, we're going to win the game and win the championship. And your mind starts to drift away to these value judgments. So another thing that Stoicism points out is value of caring enough, right? So in Stoicism, it's about, caring about indifference, understanding, navigating externals, but not caring too much, not ascribing an inappropriate amount of focus such that you start getting extreme emotion. That's another thing that I strike on. And the analogy I use when I'm talking about that, or the analogy I'll use now, is you imagine a heart surgeon, right? Do you want that surgeon that's like yawning, says, I don't really care, I have to make it to a golf game after this? Or no, you don't want that surgeon. That's the person who cares too little. Likewise, do you want a surgeon, if they're doing heart surgery on you, to be like, if I make a mistake, this person will die. Like, I am so nervous. I cannot believe that somebody's life is in my hands. This is the most important thing to ever happen. You also don't want that surgeon, right? And those are kind of the two extremes. You want the person that, I care about this. This is important, but I'm able to kind of maintain focus and not drift into that stage of passion, but also not drift into apathy. And so working with athletes or any sort of performance is about figuring out how to maintain that middle ground, which is something that Stoicism is very good at and very helpful for. Anything you want to throw in there? Because I can keep going.
Yeah, some useful concepts from a fellow named Josh Waitzkin, who is a chess master and also a martial artist. He has this idea of hard focus or soft focus, or hard zone versus soft zone. And the thought is, you have this focus, which everyone thinks is important to be focused when you're doing sport or some other activity. But for any competitor, there's a state of mind where it's what he calls hard, in the sense that you're just completely zoomed in, but it's sort of brittle in a sense. That's all you see, but particular distractions can snap you right out of it. And I think that's analogous to the state of a sort of extreme emotions or passions, where often these sorts of things can be quite useful for really zoning in or narrowing into what you might need to do, but they're not really as flexible they can't really handle things hopping up. So what you want to be able to do is get into the zone of a softer focus, where you're focused but able to let distractions arise without having sort of clenching or being so mentally invested in what's exactly is going on in front of you. So in a sense, it's almost a paradoxical idea, but it's sort of, I think, what a lot of athletes will talk about when they get into the zone. It's a state of almost relaxed intensity, as opposed to just a pure sort of adrenaline infused mania.
Yeah, I like that idea of relaxed intensity. Josh, the person you were mentioning, he was a chess prodigy and also is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. So he's very famous in the Jiu-Jitsu community and has contributed a lot to kind of Jiu-Jitsu knowledge, because he took the methodology people use to learn chess and applied that to Jiu-Jitsu. But anyways, that's a different topic. That's a different rabbit hole. I like the idea of soft focus. And again, this kind of craps analogy comes up, right? Because when you're describing that, I'm thinking about ethical performance, right? And the people that we admire the most, or people that I look up to as role models, are not these people who's like, I'm very intentionally going to do the right thing right now. And I've kind of, it's consumed me to the point that I've kind of lost the context and I've got focused on this goal. It's people who are, focused on doing the right thing, focused on acting well, courageously, justly, kindly, but they're able to kind of exist in a relaxed state in that zone, exist, as you said, kind of a soft, malleable state while also performing well.
Yeah, well, here's something I'm interested in asking about is, in some sports advice, you have this idea that there are almost two selves or two ways of thought. You have the doing self and versus the talking or verbal self. And the thought is, the doing self is just sort of what happens almost in a physical or an intuitive sense, whereas the verbal talking self is the self that, if you're playing tennis, watches the way you hit the racket and thinks, oh, my wrist was slightly in the wrong position. The way I moved my elbow, that was wrong, or that was correct, the way I, danced my feet across the court in that particular move. It's much more evaluative, and in a real sense, it's verbal. You have this running track that's going on as you perform. And what a number of people suggest, in particular, there's this book called The Inner Game of Tennis, is that to the extent you can, to try allow the doing self to do its thing when you're performing, and in a way either quiet or just accept the talking self without trying to pay too much attention to the judgments that it's making. And then let the talking self, verbal self, do its thing when you are reflecting on how well you performed and deciding maybe what you'll tweak next time or next round, as it were. So I'm curious what you thought about that approach, because it is, it's not explicitly Stoic, but it is a way to address issues of passions getting too inflamed during sport, because often these passions will emerge from the verbal self, making some judgment about what the ref did, what your performance was, and so on.
Yeah, I really like that example. I mean, the next thing I was going to talk about, which I think connects with this well, is the idea of the dichotomy of control. And because I think very naturally from what you're saying, Caleb, when we say these things, okay, get in this like kind of medium state, right? The question becomes, well, how do you do that, right? How does that work? Like, yeah, okay, I want to be there. How do I get there? And what I was thinking from your point is you're providing one example of the way you might get there, which is when it's time to do, when it's time to reflect. Don't try to reflect when you're doing, and don't try to do when you're reflecting. Keep those spheres separate. And I think of that as kind of an application of the dichotomy of control in the realm of sport. This is something that I advocate, which is that if I'm understanding your point correctly, when you're in, and that was kind of the practice and competition division I was making previously as well, where I see practice as the verbal self. Practice is reflective, it's iterative, it's critical, it takes in larger contexts, it attempts to change things. And then competition is, I think the people that compete the best are the ones that kind of recognize I'm as good as I'm going to be along almost every sphere. And I'm not going to do any sort of kind of meta improvement or meta criticism, which is to say, if you're at a basketball tournament and you realize you can't perform, I'm not very good at basketball. I just watch a lot. So my examples might be bad, but I'm not good at a certain play. It's kind of too late, right? You develop that play in practice. So your job is to kind of keep your sphere of attention or your sphere of focus on the actual doing, the doing self. That's the way I like to think about it. It's not this kind of division of two selves, but a division of your focus, really, of one self. And the way I like to think about it, the metaphor of this attention is kind of what's on stage. When you have these things on stage, only one thing can be in the spotlight at a time. And trying to have in the spotlight when you're competing, doing what you know you're supposed to do to the best of your current ability. And everything else just becomes information about that. Okay, so my job is to score, and the referee made a bad call. So now I've just received new descriptive information. Now I need to score 2 goals, but I haven't received kind of evaluative or critical information like, wow, this is terrible. Wow, this is so unfair. It's just this kind of descriptive information so that I can achieve my goal. I'm trying to kind of stay in that state. I've never thought of this doing thinking, but I think that's the right way. That's the right way to make the division. And the other thing I think is that's I'm not sure if I explained that as clearly as possible, but the basic idea is when you're competing, you're focusing on your task, your role, and everything else is just information about how to do your role better in the moment. And you're trying to stay there as much as possible. When you're practicing, then you're taking kind of just value judgments. Well, my previous training was not the right way to do it, or my previous performance was poor, or even it was great. But in the moment, you're just kind of staying, for me, in that descriptive zone. That's what I try to encourage my students to do. And the final thing about that is that ability to train your attention is in and of itself, it's a craft, right? The ability, and as you're saying, the inner game of tennis, to focus on the doing self instead of, the thinking self, that is a craft, that's a skill. And what most athletes do is they train their bodies, but they don't really train that mental skill of focus, which, like anything else, is done through iterative practice and then testing through competition. That's my thought on that. What did you think?
I think that's right. The division between competition and practice is always useful. Of course, there might be some exceptions if you have an exceptionally long season, but depending on the game and so on. But in general, the competition mode is when you can let a lot of this sort of reflective mind go off. And if you've done the work, you should be able to trust yourself to perform well and treat things as information as they arrive. I think that's the main thing that I took away from what you've said and what a lot of Stoics have written is that there's this shift to thinking about events merely as information instead of adding additional narratives or stories to them.
Exactly.
So, in the context of a game, if you get scored on, instead of adding some story about how, that reflects poorly on who your team is or something of this sort, you might just see, oh, this happened because, our defense was set up this way. We can adjust that and then move on and play to win.
Yeah, and I do that all the time, right? Like I'm not saying I'm perfect. Like I do that all the time. I'll be in the middle of some jiu-jitsu match and it's like 4 minutes in and I'm exhausted and I don't want to do this anymore. And I'll start adding, like my narrative brain starts going off, right? My narrative brain starts saying, well, you already did pretty well today. People aren't going to be disappointed with you. You'll be able to, say, oh, you lost to somebody who was pretty good. You start having that narrative brain come in and it's almost this fight, right? This fight to like stay doing this incredibly difficult, tiring thing and not just doing it, but doing it to the maximum of your ability. And that's that fight, is to kind of push out those intrusive value judgment narrative thoughts. I think I really like, I never thought of that before. I really like the idea of the narrative brain, pushing out the narrative brain, because it can also go the other way, right? It can also be, wow, I'm winning. I'm so amazing. I'm so great.
Right.
I can't wait for this match to be over or this game to be over and me to get all the accolades that I deserve, and that's also kind of a narrative brain going off. And that's just as bad, right? That is not going to serve your performance in the moment, because the best way to compete is going to be the same regardless of the narrative. So any attention on narrative is just taking attention away from the best way to compete. But I think that was an excellent insight, Caleb. I'll have to chew on that kind of narrative thoughts. I think that's the right way to put it.
Yep. I think there's the concrete suggesting that, you shouldn't, there's a risk to the positive story, saying that there's a risk to the positive story is like Seneca's line that you should never trust prosperity. And I think you can just go on YouTube for clips or different games where someone, just started celebrating before the ball had just gone over, and then some defender comes out of nowhere and will slide it away. Or you have the football team who's about to celebrate their amazing comeback, and there's a few more seconds left in the game. They kick off, and then the other team just runs the ball all the way down the field. And this is often rare, but not rare enough that you can tell the positive story and leave it at that outcome.
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole genre of YouTube of probably people that celebrate too early. Don't be that person either.
Don't be that person.
Anything else you want to dig into that before I moved into sport for Stoicism?
No, let's do sport for Stoicism.
Great. So part 3. Thanks everyone. So far, so good. And this one I think I don't know if there's kind of an elitism to philosophy. I don't know if that's right, but there's kind of this view of like, well, obviously the athletes could learn something from us because we are the masters of living. So obviously, they could learn something from what we're doing. But I think likewise, we all have a lot to learn from sport, right? I'm just talking about sport because I'm an athlete. That's what I'm excellent at. I think we have a lot to learn from any excellent craft. I think you could have this conversation with a skilled musician, have this conversation with an excellent artist, because coming back to that thing I said at the start, they're all crafts. We all have things to learn from each other. What I want to talk about now is the benefit to practicing sports if you're trying to develop your stoicism. And the first one I want to say, which I think is the real value of sport, or its unique value actually from other crafts, is that sport provides situations that are low stakes, but very difficult. I refer to this as kind of artificial difficulty. So I think of I've fought professional mixed martial arts. It's like, that's the closest you can get to simulating being in a fight for your life while also being actually relatively safe in terms of, I can give up whenever I want. If I look like I can't defend myself, if I look like I'm getting too hurt, the ref is going to stop the fight. So I'm simulating, battle. I'm simulating a fight for my life and getting kind of exposure to the benefits of that, learning about myself, learning about how I perform under pressure, learning about just what it's like to do an incredibly difficult thing and face your fears. But I'm also minimizing the downside, minimizing the risks, right? I won't actually die if I lose. The person doesn't actually kill me or enslave me or take me as a prisoner of war, things like this, right? For a less extreme example, it's just like, if you're competing in a sport, you're you're doing something hard, something tired, something people are watching, but it's just putting a ball in a hoop, right? The results of the event, barring you being a professional athlete or, your life being based around that, the results of your competition are incredibly low stakes in the grand scheme of things. But what you do is you pretend like they're high stakes. You kind of agree, everybody kind of agrees they're going to take it seriously to get exposure to the upsides, which are these character building and these kind of situations. So I said that Stoicism was like a craft. Because it's like a craft, you have to practice it to be ready for training. Some of that practice can look like, as we talked about, premeditation of evils. But some of that practice can look like doing scary things. It can look like doing difficult things. It can look like motivating yourself to live consistently. So, if I set a goal for myself, I say, I want to have a good season. I want to have a good soccer season. It's motivating yourself to eat well, motivating yourself to sleep well, motivating yourself to practice, to develop consistency in the whole of your life and routine. If we can find ways to do those things, which are all difficult things, with very little exposure to actual consequences if we fail or if we make mistakes, that's really the sweet spot. And I think sport provides that sweet spot. And for me, and I know for many people, that's why there's such an appeal to it as practitioners. That's the first thing I want to advocate for.
Yeah, I think sport can be an excellent gym to practice the Stoic virtues, really.
Yeah.
In the beginning section, we talked about how to manage emotions, how to make correct judgments, and sport is a good way to put sort of stress yourself with some situations where everyone's tempted to make incorrect judgments, and also situations where it's generally difficult to figure out what's going on or what you ought to do, what the optimal play is. So to that extent, I think the sport, like many other activities, can be an excellent way to force yourself, or maybe not so much force yourself as an excellent activity if you approach it in the right way to practice Stoicism.
Yeah, I should say that I don't think athletes are good people. I think athletes are good at their craft. But if you develop that craft with the intention of also becoming a good person, there's lots of kind of double dipping opportunities. Yeah, so you do have to approach it with the right mindset. I'm not going to be, especially in martial arts, it's the big thing where you think, wow, this person has a black belt, like they must be an excellent person. And it's just not the case, right? There's lots of terrible people who are very good at martial arts. I mean, you end up with the ethics professor example, right? It's just what has been the craft. If the craft is skill at fighting, it doesn't have anything to do with a good person. If the craft is describing ethics well, knowing a lot about ethical systems, that doesn't have anything to do with a good person. But if you try to develop your craft of being a good person, being a good Stoic while you do those other things, there's lots of opportunities to do both at the same time. The other thing I really like about sport, which kind of dips on what I was already saying, it kind of connects with what I was saying, but sport provides iterative feedback because you are able to do it, because there's low exposure to downside, you are able to do it again and again, right? So if you're preparing yourself for adversity, I hope you only have a handful of real extreme adversity in your life. I hope you don't have the opportunity to iteratively reflect on your exposure to real tragedy in your life. Like some people might, and I hope they can pull the good things from that. I mean, I think many people do, but you want as little of that as possible, right? You don't want to expose yourself to tragedy intentionally to build your character. But what you do want is lots of opportunities to respond to how to learn and respond to how you deal with those situations. And again, sport provides that. Again, connects to what I was saying before, but just this, because it's low risk, because it's low commitment, low downside, you get to just continually expose yourself and learn as you grow. And that's great. That's one thing that I've really benefited from. And another aspect is that sport really cultivates a growth mindset. So growth mindset is this idea that we're malleable. We have the capability to change who we are in terms of our character, but also in terms of our physical performance is not set in stone. This is something that maybe there's kind of an extreme spectrum, but we are able to move between that spectrum through effort and work. And a growth mindset, somebody who adopts a growth mindset has a strong conception of their agency, their capacity to influence who they are, right? And their capacity to navigate the world the way they want to. Mm-hmm. Now, Stoicism encourages us to be humble about our capacity to control external things, but it is very aggressive in our capacity to kind of control, determine, shape our internal lives. And I think if you've come to Stoicism as an athlete, or you've practiced any other craft where you say, wow, if I put work into this, I actually see results. If I put work into this, that work yields dividends. I can become different. And so sport, and especially exercising, I think is like the clearest example of this, teaches people that, empowers people that. Now, if you take that mindset and you bring it to Stoicism, doesn't just become a set of cool ideas. It becomes, wow, if I work on this, I could become different. If I work on this, I could transform myself. And if you come with that mindset, you're actually more likely to transform yourself. So I think that empowering, that kind of empowerment, that sense of agency, that growth mindset is something that I've taken from sport. And, one thing that Epictetus talks about is he makes this comparison between muscles and character. So he's talking to his students and he says, look, I don't want to look at your weights. Like, I don't want to see your weight collection, which is all their books they have, the kind of exercise they've been doing. He's like, I want to see the muscle. I want to see the transformation that's come from using those weights, the change that has come from doing that. And that's the growth mindset, is this idea of when we're practicing Stoicism, we're not collecting facts. We're not collecting anecdotes. We're not collecting quotes. Whoa, Epictetus said this interesting thing. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius said this interesting thing. We're building our muscles. We're transforming who we are as people. And that's the fundamental goal. And if you bring that mindset, or most athletes, and if you bring that mindset to philosophy, it really, really transforms the way you approach philosophy.
Absolutely. I think the most powerful impact sport can have for a Stoic is it can play this self-signaling function, which can build your confidence and really be a part of someone's self-transformation. So I know a number of people who have found themselves in a rut, in a relatively dark place, and they might have lower self-esteem as a result of something of being in that scenario. And there are many things one can do in that situation, but one type of advice that many people offer is to find a craft, to find a sport, if you will, where you can improve, see that concrete improvement in real time, and signal to yourself that transformation is possible. You can be the sort of person who masters a craft. And I think if you do that again and again, you will look back with years of improvement, not just ideally in particular crafts, but in your own personal life as well. You're building up and proving to yourself that you are the sort of person who can improve both externally, but also, and perhaps more importantly, that you made the decisions, that you pushed through whatever doubts or suffering arose to get to that place where you now have a black belt, or you now have much faster mile time, or whatever it is. So I think that's, for me, probably, and personally for me, that's one of the best things that sports can offer, is apart from being quite a lot of fun, you can look back and say, oh, I can push through this spot in my life just as I push through in all these other ways.
Yeah, I think that's great. And then, because Caleb, you're a runner. And when I mentioned weightlifting, because I think weightlifting is a good example, like lifting weights, exercising is a good example, because it's so concrete. Like, I could pick up 100 pounds, now I can pick up 120 pounds. And running is another one of those things that's very concrete. Like, my 5-kilometer time was this, or my 5-mile time was this, and now it is a minute less. I am a better runner. But character is abstract, and it's like, it can be, that's the first thing you develop. It's a very intimidating thing to develop, right? Mm-hmm. I think of that like in martial arts. We have belts for that reason, because martial arts is abstract. You don't have a number that associates with your skill. So you often end up comparing yourself to other people. But the problem is, these other people are also training. They're also getting better. So you can train for years in martial arts and not beat the people that you started with, because they are also getting better. So what we use in martial arts is we use belts so that somebody who's experienced, somebody who's knowledgeable, is like giving you feedback on your progress and building your confidence, as you said, so that these people feel empowered and more likely to do it. And I guess there's 2 points there. Just to reiterate, one is this growth mindset, like you can do that. You can make progress. You've done it before in sport or in exercise or in running or weightlifting. You can do it with your character. That's one point. And I guess the other point, which I wasn't thinking about before, is like, yeah, it's okay to kind of take, not to be vain, but it's okay to take some degree of enjoyment in progress, some degree of enjoyment and kind of improvement, however incremental. I think kind of journaling and reflection can serve that purpose in Stoicism. But, being okay with kind of reflecting on, not resting on your laurels, but identifying that you have some laurels and being like, that's great. I didn't have some laurels before and I'm glad I do now. The last thing I'm going to talk about that we can learn from sport is that Stoics could learn from sport is that sport is really good at role modeling or recognizing the benefits of role models. One thing, every hockey player knows who Wayne Gretzky is, right? And I'm showing my Canadian, and every hockey player wants to be like Wayne Gretzky, admires that person and has aspirations toward that person and seeks to emulate them, right? And athletes just naturally understand, or through trial and error have understood the benefit of role modeling, the benefit of observing others, attempting to practice them, and incorporate the beneficial into your own style, into your own game, into your own perspective. And in one sense, it's also agency increasing. Well, if they did it, I can do it, right? If that person could do it and they came from the same city as me, or they're the same height as me or the same weight as me, if they could make it into the NHL, so can I. It's empowering. But on one aspect, it's also just information. Like, wow, that person is a master at their craft. And I'm learning from a master at their craft by watching them. Mm-hmm. And I think we as Stoics, we talk a lot about contemplation of the sage, but that's really what it is. You're watching the Michael Jordan, you're trying to think of the Michael Jordan, the Wayne Gretzky, the Tiger Woods of being courageous, being just, being moderate, being kind, being wise. You're trying to look for those masters of the craft and incorporate that information. Both say, hey, I can do that if they can, and learn something about how to do it because I've watched them do it. And I think if people thought of the contemplation of the sage less as this kind of dramatic or abstract exercise and more as like, just think about somebody who's, really good at this and how they do it and learn from it. That's something that Stoics could benefit from.
Absolutely. I think at Stoa, we try to incorporate the contemplation of the sage as a regular practice and do things like Seneca advised, picture a panel of people and how they would respond to your actions during the day, or choose a model and imagine how they would go through your day if they were to take your place. And I think what you find in people who become exceptionally good performers is that they have very clear pictures of who their models were, to the extent that you might even be surprised about how many details they know about their sports hero's life, about specific games. And they use that both in the strategic sense when they're thinking about how to make decisions, but it also, I think it just expresses how much they care about the game. And as Stoics, I think we can do the same thing by focusing on people we admire and who we want to emulate. And I think that's a really good upshot from sports, a very clear similarity.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Caleb, but it shows how much they care about the game, right? Like they're just fans of the game. And so the question for the Stoic is, well, what's our game? Well, our game is living well, right? So you got to be if you want to be a good Stoic, you got to be a fan of the game, which means you got to care about living well. You got to look for examples of it. You got to look up to those people that do it well and admire them, even if they're not Stoics, right? Even if they're, whatever example of excellence they are. But yeah, I think that's, for me, if we can conclude on something, that's an excellent idea, which is just be a fan of the game, and both in terms of enjoying playing it, loving getting better at it, and admiring others that are good at it. I think if Stoics took that, that's really helpful for Stoicism. That's really helpful for any lived philosophy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say one difference that from sport and Stoicism is that, of course, Stoicism has a much larger is not even the right word, a much more immense in importance, a game of much more immense importance, and a much more complex game, this game of life, as it were. So if I think we were to pick on one difference between sports and Stoicism, it sort of comes out in a story that Plutarch records about a Spartan, which a Spartan loses a wrestling match and someone comes up to him and says, "Your opponent proved himself the better man." And the Spartan responds, "No, a better wrestler." And I think that's always a useful reminder when thinking about sport and incorporating it into living better, but also not, of course, losing the vision that what we want to do is live better, not merely be a better wrestler.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I mean, I both think that's quite an inspiring line, but also I'll keep that in my back pocket to preserve my ego too, moving forward. Whenever I lose, I'll be like, no, we'll try some ping pong and then we'll see.
That's right. I'll play Smash
Just be
Brothers.
one very small part of myself, which doesn't even matter to me that much. No, great. Yeah. Fun as always, Caleb. Anything else you want to add?
No, this is great. It's good. This is
Awesome.
a conversation. Good conversation.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Excellent. Wow.